The first time I saw the human, I laughed. Not quietly. Not behind my hand. I laughed the way a Vithari combat instructor laughs when something genuinely absurd walks into her arena, which is to say loudly, openly, and with every intention of being heard. My sparring partner, a Gorvathi named Dren, stopped mid-swing and looked at me like I had lost my mind. I pointed with one extended claw toward the arena's main entrance, where the newest arrival to the Crucible was walking through security processing. He was unremarkable in every way I could measure. Average height for a human. Average build. No ceremonial combat gear. No rank decorations visible on his chest. No weapon harness. No species pride markings. His face carried the kind of stillness that I associated with either deep stupidity or deep boredom, and I was betting heavily on the first option. His registration tag scrolled across the arena's intake display. CADE, Terran Frontier Corps. Observer status. Observer. I read that word 3 times to make sure I was not hallucinating. The Crucible was the most prestigious joint species combat exhibition in the sector. Every major allied species sent their best fighters here to train, compete, and establish dominance through skill. The Gorvathi sent their champion grapplers. The Kethrani sent their blade dancers. My own people, the Vithari, sent instructors like me, fighters who had earned the right to teach through decades of proven lethality. And the Terran delegation had sent an observer, a man who came to watch. I turned to Dren and said it loud enough for half the intake hall to hear. I told him that the humans must have run out of actual fighters and sent a clerk instead. Dren, who was 7 feet tall and covered in armored scales, rumbled with amusement. Several Kethrani nearby clicked their blade limbs in what passed for laughter among their kind. Even the intake officers exchanged glances. The human heard me. I know he did, because his eyes moved in my direction for exactly 1 second. Then they moved away again, as if I had been a wall fixture that briefly caught his attention before proving irrelevant. He collected his intake credentials, picked up a single standard-issue duffel bag, and walked toward the residential block without a word. That dismissal burned me more than any insult could have. It was repurposed 40 years ago as a shared combat training facility after the Treaty of Keldris, when 6 species agreed that it was better to test each other's fighters in controlled environments than to find out the hard way during actual conflicts. The Crucible operates on a simple principle. You come here to fight. You earn standing through combat. Your species' reputation rises or falls based on how their representatives perform in the ranked sparring tournaments that the station hosts 3 times per cycle. Diplomatic staff, medical personnel, and tactical analysts sometimes attend to study the proceedings, but they are background figures. They sit in the upper tiers and take notes, and everyone politely pretends they are not there. For a species to register an observer as their primary representative in the exhibition roster was not just unusual, it was borderline insulting to the institution. I spent the rest of that first day in a state of amused contempt. I trained hard in the lower rings, running drills with my Vithari cohort, sharpening the techniques that had earned me my instructor rank. My claws are retractable, our species' signature advantage in close combat, combined with low-light vision that lets me fight in near-total darkness, and reflexes that operate roughly twice as fast as most galactic standard species. A Vithari combat instructor is not someone you want to meet in a confined space. I had earned my position through 63 ranked bouts with a record of 60 wins. The 3 losses had come against opponents who outweighed me by a factor of 3 or more, and even those fights had been close enough to earn me respect. I had earned every centimeter of ground I stood on. This human had earned nothing. Over the next 2 days, I watched the Crucible fill with fighters from across Allied space. A Gorvathi grappling team of 4, each one massive enough to block a corridor simply by standing in it. A Kathrani blade dance troupe of 6, their biocrystalline limbs catching the light like sharpened glass. A pair of Drenari close-quarter specialists, compact and fast, their forearms giving them an advantage in simultaneous attack and defense. A Thessian heavy combat unit, 3 fighters clad in powered exoskeletons that amplified their already considerable strength. Every single one of them arrived in full ceremonial combat gear. Every single one of them registered for active participation in the tournament brackets. Every single one of them walked through the Crucible's corridors with the bearing of fighters who had come to prove something. And then there was Cade. I saw him at meals, sitting alone at a corner table, eating whatever the station's galley offered without complaint. I saw him in the observation tiers during practice sessions, watching the sparring rings with an intensity that seemed disproportionate for a man who apparently had no intention of stepping into one. He carried a datapad everywhere and made notes constantly, his stylus moving in quick, precise strokes that suggested he was cataloging something specific. When fighters performed exceptional techniques, his attention sharpened. When fighters made errors, his stylus moved faster. He was studying, not casually, not the way a tourist studies an exotic animal in a containment facility. He was studying the way a predator studies terrain before a hunt, methodical and purposeful, and patient. What I saw was a man with no combat record, no visible skills, and no apparent reason to be taking up space in a facility designed for people who actually fought for a living. On the third day, I made him a public joke. I was standing in the central ring area with a group of instructors and fighters from multiple species, the informal gathering that always formed in the days before a tournament, when competitors sized each other up and established the social hierarchy that would influence challenge selections. I was telling a story about a training exercise that had gone wrong, a funny one, involving a Gorvathi who had accidentally demolished a sparring ring's containment barrier with an overcommitted throw. The group was laughing, the energy was good, and then I spotted Cade walking along the upper observation rail, datapad in hand, watching us. I pointed up at him and said that perhaps we should all fight more quietly, so as not to disturb the Terran delegation's very important research into how combat looks from a safe distance. The laughter was immediate and loud. Even the Gorvathi, who generally respected humans for their stubbornness in past conflicts, chuckled at that one. The Kethrani clicked in amusement. A Drenari officer I knew well, a four-armed fighter named Tavril, shook his head with a grin. Cade looked down at us. His expression did not change. He held my gaze for perhaps 3 seconds, and in those 3 seconds, I felt something I did not expect. It was not anger or embarrassment or wounded pride. It was nothing. His eyes held absolutely nothing that I could read, and for a Vithari, whose predatory instincts are built around reading micro-expressions and body language for signs of weakness, encountering a face that gave away zero information was deeply unsettling. Then he went back to his notes. I told myself it did not bother me. I told myself he was simply too dull to understand that he had been insulted. I told myself a lot of things that night, as I lay in my quarters, and stared at the ceiling, and tried to figure out why a man who refused to react to anything was occupying so much space in my thoughts. The next morning, I was walking through the residential corridor toward the training rings when I passed a group of Drenari soldiers heading in the opposite direction. There were 5 of them, all in combat gear, all clearly on their way to a practice session. They were talking among themselves in the rapid-fire cadence of their native language, 4 arms gesturing as they debated technique. Then Cade stepped out of a doorway ahead of them. The conversation stopped. All 5 Drenari went quiet simultaneously, as if someone had pressed a mute button on the group. They moved to the side of the corridor, giving Cade a wide berth as he passed. Not aggressively, not with hostility or resentment. They moved the way you move when you encounter something in a narrow space, and your instincts tell you that the wisest course of action is to give it room. Cade nodded to them as he passed, a small, polite acknowledgement. The Drenari nodded back. One of them, a senior fighter with campaign scars across 2 of his 4 arms, watched Cade's back as he walked away, and the expression on his face was one I recognized from my years as a combat instructor. It was the look fighters give to something they have decided is not worth the risk of testing. I told myself that the Terran Frontier Corps probably had some kind of diplomatic arrangement with the Drenari that required formal courtesies. I told myself that the look on that scarred soldier's face was professional respect, nothing more. I told myself a lot of things during those first few days at the Crucible. I was wrong about all of them. 48 fighters across 8 species, organized into elimination rounds by weight class and combat style. My name was in the mid-tier Predator bracket, which suited me perfectly. The Gorvathi dominated the heavy bracket. The Kithrani owned the blade weapon category. The Dranari filled the multi-limb specialist division. Cade's name appeared nowhere. I checked twice. 3 times. He was not registered in any bracket, any division, any category. He remained exactly what his intake tag said he was: an observer. A man who had traveled across half the sector to sit in the stands and take notes, while real fighters bled for their species' honor. That evening, as the pre-tournament feast filled the station's main hall with the noise and energy of warriors preparing for competition, I found myself standing near the entrance when Cade walked in. He had changed out of his gray uniform into what I assumed was the Terran equivalent of dress casual, a simple dark shirt and standard-issue trousers. He still carried no rank insignia, he still wore no decorations. He looked like a maintenance technician who had wandered into the wrong room. I stepped into his path. He stopped, looked at me, waited. I told him that the feast was for competitors, and that the observation lounge had its own food service. Several nearby fighters heard me and watched to see what would happen. Cade looked at me for a long moment. Then he said, in a voice that carried no emotion at all, that the station commander had personally invited all registered delegates to the feast, and that he intended to eat dinner. He stepped around me and walked to a table near the far wall, where he sat alone and ate his meal in silence. Nobody joined him. Nobody bothered him either. And for the first time, I noticed that those two things might not be the same. The tournament began the next morning, and I had my first bout within the opening hour. My opponent was a Thessian heavy combat specialist named Gorath, a fighter who outweighed me by nearly double, but relied too heavily on his exoskeleton's amplified strength at the expense of footwork. I took him apart in 4 minutes, using my speed advantage to stay inside his strike radius, where his power meant nothing, and my claws meant everything. The crowd roared. My Vithari cohort stomped their approval. I felt the familiar rush of combat victory, the primal satisfaction of proving that evolution had built my species to win. As I walked off the sparring floor, breathing hard, and covered in the Thessian's coolant fluid from a ruptured exoskeleton seal, I looked up at the observation tier. Cade was watching me. His datapad was in his hand. His stylus was moving. He was taking notes on my fight. I should have been flattered. An observer documenting my technique for the Terran Frontier Corps should have been a compliment, a recognition that my combat style was worth studying. Instead, I felt something cold move through my chest, because the look on his face was not admiration, it was assessment. He was not watching me the way a student watches a teacher. He was watching me the way I watched prey animals during survival training on my homeworld. Calm, patient, cataloging weaknesses and exploitable patterns with the detached efficiency of someone building a file that would one day be used to take apart everything I could do. I looked away. I told myself I was imagining things. But that night, alone in my quarters, I cleaned my claws and checked them twice for damage that was not there, and I could not stop thinking about the way his stylus had moved when I executed my killing combination against the Thessian. He had not been impressed. He had been prepared. The tournament's second day brought harder fights and bigger crowds. The Crucible's arena complex held nearly 3,000 spectators across multiple observation tiers, and every seat was full. Species pride was at stake. Reputations were being forged and broken with every bout. I won my second match against a Drenari forearm specialist, a brutal 7-minute battle that left me with a cracked rib guard and a deep sense of satisfaction. The Drenari was fast and technically excellent, but I had fought enough of their kind to know that their lower left arm always telegraphed their combination attacks a half-second before execution. I exploited that tell ruthlessly and put him on the mat with a claw lock to the throat that ended the bout without drawing blood. The crowd loved it. Clean victories against skilled opponents were the Crucible's highest currency, and I was spending it well. Between matches, I held court in the fighter preparation area, surrounded by my Vithari cohort and a rotating cast of fighters from other species who wanted to discuss technique, offer congratulations, or simply bask in the tournament's electric atmosphere. I was in my element. This was what I had trained for, what I had bled for, what I had built my entire career around. I was a predator among predators, and I was performing. And then I made the mistake of trying to drag Cade into my spotlight. It happened during a break between the second and third rounds. The preparation area was crowded with fighters from 6 different species, all of them riding the adrenaline of recent bouts or preparing for upcoming ones. The energy was loud and sharp and competitive. I was retelling my victory over the Drenari, demonstrating the claw lock technique that had ended the fight, when I noticed Cade standing at the edge of the preparation area. He was watching a Kethrani blade dancer perform a warm-up sequence, his datapad out, his stylus moving in those same precise strokes. I saw an opportunity, and I took it. I told him that the preparation area was usually reserved for people who actually prepared for fights, but that he was welcome to come down to the sparring floor if he wanted to experience what combat felt like instead of just writing about it. I said it with warmth in my voice and venom in my words, the combination that Vithari social dynamics taught us to use when establishing dominance over a rival without appearing overtly aggressive. Every fighter in the room turned to look at Cade. He lowered his datapad slowly. He looked at me, and for the second time since his arrival, his eyes held something I could not read. Then he said something that I did not understand at the time, but that I have replayed in my mind every single day since. He said, "I appreciate the invitation, instructor, but I have learned that the most dangerous place to stand is between someone and the lesson they have not finished teaching themselves." Then he put his datapad away, nodded to the Kethrani blade dancer, and walked out of the preparation area. The room was quiet for 3 full seconds after he left. Then the Gorvathi grappler Dren made a joke about humans and their love of cryptic responses, and everyone laughed, and the moment passed. But Tavrel, the Drenari officer I had known for years, did not laugh. He was watching the doorway Cade had walked through, and his expression was troubled. I caught his eye and raised a questioning brow ridge. He shook his head slightly and looked away. He was standing with his upper arms folded and his lower arms hanging loose, which in Drenari body language indicated that he was thinking about something he did not want to be thinking about. I asked him what was wrong. He looked at me for a long moment. Then he said, very carefully, that he would strongly suggest I stop making the human a target of my humor. I asked him why. He said that his People's Intelligence Division had a file on the Terran Frontier Corps, and that the soldiers assigned observer status at foreign military installations were never simple observers. I pressed him. I asked him what they actually were. Tavril was quiet for several seconds. Then he said something that planted the first real seed of doubt in my mind. He said, "Ask the Apex Hunters when they arrive tomorrow. Ask them if they know the name Cade, and pay close attention to how they answer." He walked away before I could respond. That night, the station received a docking notification that sent a ripple of excitement and anxiety through every species aboard. The Vorath Call had confirmed their arrival for the tournament's final bracket. The Apex Hunters were coming. I had seen Vorath Call exactly twice in my life, both times at previous Crucible exhibitions, and both times they had dominated the competition so thoroughly that the final brackets had felt like formalities rather than contests. They were the galaxy's apex predator species, a designation they held not through political maneuvering or technological advantage, but through raw, terrifying biological superiority. 7 feet tall on average. Bio-armored skin that could deflect blade strikes. Quad-hinged jaws capable of crushing industrial-grade alloys. And sensory organs so refined that they could detect a heartbeat through a solid wall. They had never lost a ranked bout at the Crucible. Not once. Not in 40 years. The Vorath Call were the standard against which all other predator species measured themselves, and I wanted to see them in action again. I wanted to study their techniques the way Cade studied mine, with the clinical precision of someone who understood that knowledge was the sharpest weapon of all. And underneath that thrill, buried so deep I almost did not recognize it, was the echo of Tavrel's words. Ask the apex hunters if they know the name Cade. I told myself that Tavrel was being dramatic, that the Drenari loved their intelligence files and their whispered warnings because it made them feel important. But I did not sleep well that night, and when I finally drifted off, I dreamed of Cade's eyes, flat and empty, and reading me like a datapad full of weaknesses I did not know I had. The Vorath Call shuttle docked at the Crucible's military bay at 0600 station time. I was in the corridor leading to the main concourse when they came aboard, and I made sure I had a clear line of sight. 3 of them, a hunting triad, the standard Vorath Call combat unit. The first one through the airlock was the Alpha, and the sight of him hit me in the chest like a physical impact. He was taller than I had remembered, easily 7.5 feet, with bio-armored plating across his shoulders and chest that shifted color as he moved, cycling through shades of dark gray and matte black like living camouflage. His quad-hinged jaw was closed, but I could see the seams where it could split open to reveal a secondary set of crushing mandibles that could bite through a pressure suit. His eyes were forward set, deep amber, and they swept the corridor with the mechanical precision of targeting sensors. Behind him came the other 2 members of the triad, both slightly smaller, both radiating the same controlled menace. They moved in perfect formation, 3 predators operating as a single organism, each one covering sight lines that the others could not. The corridor cleared ahead of them, not slowly, not casually. It cleared the way water parts around a hot blade. The Gorvathi, who were physically large enough to contest the corridor space, chose not to. The Kethrani retracted their blade limbs tight against their bodies in what I recognized as a submission reflex. I held my ground. I was a Vithari combat instructor, and I had my pride. But I will admit that my claws extended involuntarily as they passed, a predator's autonomic response to the presence of something that my body recognized as a greater threat than my conscious mind wanted to acknowledge. He registered me, categorized me, and dismissed me in a single glance. I was not worth his attention. I was furniture in a hallway full of furniture. Their arrival reshaped the entire social landscape of the station within hours. Conversations lowered when they entered rooms. Training sessions paused when they walked past sparring rings. The pre-tournament hierarchy that had been building over the past week was instantly reshuffled by the simple fact of their presence. The Alpha was registered as Krethvol. His two subordinates were listed as Jar and Thesson. Their combined combat record across previous Crucible exhibitions was 41 wins and 0 losses. 0. I spent the morning watching them train. Their sessions were closed to general observation, but I knew the Crucible's layout well enough to find a secondary observation port that gave me a partial view of their sparring ring. What I saw made my blood move faster. They were magnificent and terrible in equal measure. Their fighting style was not a style at all in the way that most species understood the term. It was predation. Pure, refined, evolved predation, stripped of everything that was not essential. No wasted movement, no flourishes, no techniques designed to look impressive. Every strike was delivered with exactly the amount of force required to disable the target, no more and no less. Every defense was a redirection that flowed immediately into a counterattack. They fought the way gravity pulled things down, with an inevitability that made resistance feel like a violation of natural law. Krethvol, the Alpha, was the most terrifying fighter I had ever seen. He moved with a fluid economy that seemed to violate his massive size, transitioning between offensive and defensive postures with the seamless precision of something that had been hunting for millions of years before my species had learned to walk upright. I was so absorbed in watching the Vorath call that I almost missed it. Almost. Movement in my peripheral vision drew my attention away from the sparring ring, and I turned my head to find that I was not the only one watching the apex hunters train. 30 meters away, standing at a different observation port with a perfect line of sight to the same ring, Cade had his datapad out. His stylus was moving faster than I had ever seen it move. I watched him watch them, and something about the intensity of his focus triggered a memory. I had seen that exact quality of attention once before. Years ago, During a field exercise on a border world, a Vithari scout had been observing a pack of apex predators native to the planet, cataloging their hunting patterns before our unit moved through their territory. The scout's focus had been absolute, not because the predators were beautiful, but because understanding exactly how they hunted was the difference between passing through their territory alive and being found in pieces by the recovery team. That was how Cade watched the Vorath call. Not with awe, not with fear, with the absolute focus of someone who needed to understand every single thing about how they moved, because his survival, or the survival of someone he cared about, might one day depend on that understanding. The thought chilled me, and for the first time, I did not push the chill away. The tournament's final bracket was announced that afternoon, and the challenge round was scheduled for the following day. The challenge round was the Crucible's signature event, the moment where individual fighters could call out specific opponents across species lines for one-on-one bouts. It was where legends were made. It was where a mid-tier fighter could challenge a champion and either rise to glory or fall in spectacular fashion. It was, in every meaningful sense, the heart of what the Crucible existed to provide. Any registered fighter could issue a challenge to any other registered fighter or delegate. The challenged party could accept or decline, but declining carried a significant social cost that most fighters found unacceptable. Challenges were public, formal, and binding once accepted. I planned to challenge one of the lesser Vorath Call fighters, either Jar or Thesson, not Krethvol. I was confident, not delusional, but testing myself against one of the Triad's subordinate members would establish my standing as a serious Predator-class fighter, regardless of the outcome. That evening, I attended the pre-challenge gathering in the arena's central hall. The atmosphere was thick with tension and excitement. Fighters clustered in species groups, talking strategy, assessing potential opponents, running the calculations of risk and reward that defined the challenge round. I moved through the crowd with the easy confidence of someone who knew exactly where she stood in the hierarchy. And then I saw something that stopped me cold. Cade was standing near the far wall of the hall, his datapad closed for once, a drink in his hand. That was not what stopped me. What stopped me was who he was standing with. A Gorvathi fighter, one of their largest, was leaning down to speak with Cade in low tones. The Gorvathi's body language was wrong. It was all wrong. Gorvathi communicated dominance through physical height and proximity. They stood tall and close to assert authority, and they leaned down to address smaller beings with an implicit reminder of their size advantage. But this Gorvathi was leaning down to Cade the way a junior officer leans down to a seated commander. Cade said something I could not hear. The Gorvathi nodded slowly, seriously, and straightened. He said something back, Cade responded. And then the Gorvathi did something I had never seen a Gorvathi do in a social setting. He stepped back. He put one massive fist against his chest in the Gorvathi gesture of acknowledged authority, and he walked away. I stood there, my drink forgotten in my hand, trying to reconcile what I had just seen with everything I believed about the quiet, unremarkable human who had come to the crucible to watch. Before I could process it, a Kethrani blade dancer passed Cade on her way to the refreshment station. She was one of their best, a senior fighter with crystalline limb structures that caught the light like weapons made of frozen starlight. As she passed Cade, she nodded to him. Not a casual nod, not the polite acknowledgement you give a fellow station occupant in passing. A formal nod, the kind I had seen Kethrani give to their own war leaders, the kind that carried the weight of institutional respect. Cade nodded back, equally formal. My drink was getting warm in my hand. My claws were extended again without my permission. I found Tavrel 20 minutes later, standing near one of the secondary exits, with the look of someone who was debating whether to attend the next round of social obligations or retreat to the peace of his quarters. I grabbed his upper right arm and pulled him into a side corridor with enough force that he blinked all four eyes at me in surprise. I asked him to explain. I told him what I had seen, the Gorvathi deferring to Cade, the Kethrani offering formal acknowledgement, the Drenari soldiers in the corridor on the third day, stepping aside like they were clearing a path for something they did not want to get close to. He reminded me of his previous advice. Ask the apex hunters. Ask them if they know the name. Then he said one more thing before walking away. He said, Salith, I have served in the Drenari military for 30 years. I have fought in 9 border conflicts and killed enemies with my own hands. I tell you this so that you understand the weight of what I am about to say. There are men and women in the Terran Frontier Corps whose operational records are classified above my clearance level. The humans I have met whose records carry that classification share one common trait. They are all very, very quiet, and the quiet ones are the ones that my commanders told me to never, ever turn my back on. Not because they would betray me, because they exist in a place where the rules I trained under no longer apply. Do with that what you will. That night, I accessed the Crucible's combat database from a terminal in the research wing. I searched for Cade's name. His official profile was sparse to the point of absurdity. Name, species, affiliation, observer status, no combat record, no rank history, no previous Crucible attendance. But there was something else. Next to his name, at the bottom of his profile where most fighters had links to their bout recordings and performance analytics, there was a single icon I had only seen once before in my 12 years of attending Crucible exhibitions. It was a restricted file flag, a red classification marker that indicated the existence of additional information accessible only to station command and species-level military liaisons. The flag itself told me nothing about what the file contained, but its existence told me everything about what it meant. Restricted file flags were not applied to observers. They were not applied to clerks or analysts or diplomatic staff. They were applied to individuals whose complete profiles contained information that, if widely known, would disrupt the normal functioning of the installation. I stared at that red flag for a long time. Then I closed the terminal and went back to my quarters and lay in the dark and listened to my own heartbeat and thought about a man in a gray uniform who took notes while predators performed and never once flinched when an Apex combat instructor tried to make him small. The challenge round began at 0900, and the arena was packed to capacity. Every seat in every tier was filled. Every observation rail was lined with spectators. The atmosphere was electric, the kind of charged anticipation that only comes when warriors from across the galaxy gather in one place to witness the collisions that define species' reputations for years to come. I was seated in the fighter preparation area, running through my warm-up routine, when the first challenges were announced. A Gorvathi grappler challenged a Thessian heavy combat specialist. A Kethrani blade dancer challenged a Drenari forearm fighter. I had formally challenged Jar, the second-ranked Vorath Call fighter, and the announcement of my name alongside his sent a visible ripple through the crowd. A Vethari, challenging a Vorath call was not unheard of, but it was rare enough to be notable. I felt the weight of my species' pride on my shoulders, and I welcomed it. But before my bout was called, something happened that nobody had anticipated. He was a decent fighter, competent, but not exceptional. The kind of warrior who had enough skill to avoid embarrassment, but not enough to be remembered. He had clearly decided that the challenge round was his chance to make a name for himself. He issued a formal challenge to Cade. The arena noise dropped by half in the space of 1 second. I sat up straighter. Around me, fighters exchanged confused glances. The challenge was technically legal, because Cade was a registered delegate, but challenging an observer was considered deeply unusual. It was also, in most fighters' eyes, a low-risk way to claim a public victory, because who would expect an observer to be able to fight? Goran stood at the challenge podium with his chest puffed out, clearly pleased with himself. The crowd murmured. The arena officials processed the challenge and turned to the observation tier, where Cade was seated to await his response. Cade had not moved. He sat in his seat, with his datapad closed on his knee, looking down at Goran with the same unreadable expression he had worn since the day he arrived. Before Cade could respond, before the arena officials could formally present the challenge for acceptance or refusal, a sound cut through the arena that silenced everything. Seven and a half feet of bio-armored apex predator straightened to his full height, and the visual impact was enough to freeze every living thing in the arena. His amber eyes were locked on the challenge podium. He did not address Goran. He addressed the arena officials. His voice was deep enough to vibrate in my chest cavity from 50 meters away. He spoke in Galactic Standard, the common language used at the Crucible, and every word was precise and deliberate. He said that the challenge was inadvisable and should be withdrawn. Goran, to his credit, or perhaps his foolishness, did not immediately comply. He turned to face Krethval and asked, with a tremor in his voice that he could not quite hide, why the Vorath Call were intervening in a challenge that did not involve their species. Krethval did not answer the question. He looked at Cade. Cade looked back at him. Something passed between them in that moment. I could not define it. I could not read it. But I could feel it, the way you can feel a storm approaching before the sky changes color. It was an exchange that had nothing to do with words, and everything to do with the kind of understanding that only exists between beings who have encountered each other at the absolute boundary of what a living thing can survive. Krethvoll held that gaze for 3 seconds. Then he turned back to the arena officials and said, "I have stated my position. The challenge is inadvisable." Then he sat back down. The arena was silent. Completely, utterly silent. 3,000 beings from 8 species sat in their seats and said nothing. Goran withdrew his challenge. He did it quickly, without argument, and walked off the challenge podium with the stiff-legged gait of someone whose body wanted to run, but whose pride would not permit it. I sat in my seat and felt the world shift under me. They did not warn anyone. They did not concern themselves with the challenges issued between lesser fighters in tournament formats that they considered beneath their natural hunting grounds. In 40 years of Crucible history, a Vorath call had never once spoken during a challenge that did not directly involve their own triad. And Krethvoll, the alpha of the most feared hunting triad in the current rotation, had just stood up in front of 3,000 witnesses and told a fighter not to challenge the quiet human in the gray uniform. He caught Krethvoll's eye and gave a small nod. Not gratitude, not submission, not relief. Acknowledgement. The nod of one equal to another. And Krethvoll nodded back. My bout against Jar was called 20 minutes later, and I fought well. I lasted nearly 6 minutes against a Vorath Call subordinate fighter, which was longer than most non-Vorath Call had managed in recent memory. I lost, ultimately, because Jar's bio-armored plating absorbed my claw strikes without meaningful damage, and his counter-grapple was strong enough to pin my arms in a hold that left me no leverage to escape. I tapped out cleanly, without injury, and the crowd gave me a standing ovation that would have been the proudest moment of my career under normal circumstances. But I barely heard it, because my mind was still in that moment when Krethvoll had stood up and the universe had rearranged itself around a human who was supposed to be nothing. That evening, I went looking for answers. I found Cade in the lower observation ring, the quietest section of the station, a curved corridor, with floor-to-ceiling viewports that looked out on the dead star the Crucible orbited. He was standing with his hands clasped behind his back, watching the star's faintly glowing remnant, the way some people watch fires, with the settled stillness of someone who has spent a lot of time alone with their thoughts. No jokes, no mockery, no performance for an invisible audience. I stood next to him and looked out at the dead star and waited until the silence between us had existed long enough to mean something. Then I asked him, plainly and without games, what he was. He did not look at me immediately. He watched the star for a few more seconds, and I saw something in his reflection on the viewport glass that I had missed every other time I had looked at him. Lines around his eyes that were too deep for his age. A set to his jaw that spoke of clenching, that had become permanent. And in his eyes, visible only in reflection. Visible only because the glass caught what his direct gaze concealed. Something that looked like an ocean with no bottom. I told him that the Vorath Call Alpha did not stand up in a packed arena to protect someone who just watches. He considered that. Then he said, Krethval and I have an understanding, and he does not want your tournament complicated by something it is not designed to handle. I asked him what that meant. He turned to look at me for the first time, and something shifted in his expression. Not warmth. Not coldness. Something between the two. A recognition that I had moved from mockery to genuine inquiry, and that the shift deserved a different kind of response. He said, It means that I am not here to fight anyone. I am here to learn how everyone fights. Those are very different missions, with very different outcomes. Krethval understands the difference. I would appreciate it if you tried to understand it as well. Then he turned back to the viewport. I stood there for another minute, hoping he would say more. He did not. He watched the dead star with the patience of someone who had learned to wait in places where patience was the only thing keeping him alive. I left. But I walked slowly, and twice I looked back, and both times he was standing exactly where I had left him, motionless, and watching the light of a star that had burned out long before either of our species had learned what stars were. That night, I lay in my quarters with my claws retracted, and my heart doing something it had not done since my first year of combat training. The rhythm of a predator who has realized that she is not the most dangerous thing in the room, and has no idea when that stopped being true. And somewhere in the back of my mind, beneath the pride and the confusion and the slowly building dread, a question was forming that I could not yet bring myself to ask out loud. If the apex hunters know his name, and knowing it is enough to make them stand up in a crowded arena and tell a fighter to walk away, then what did this man do to earn that kind of recognition from the most lethal predator species in the galaxy? And why is he so quiet about it? Sleep came late that night, and when it came, I dreamed of corridors that stretched forever, and a sound like footsteps that never got closer and never fell behind. The previous day's events had shifted the station's social currents in ways that were subtle but unmistakable. Fighters who had previously ignored Cade now tracked him with their eyes when he entered a room. Groups that had laughed at my jokes about the Terran observer now fell silent when his name came up. The whisper network that connected every species aboard the station was buzzing with theories, speculation, and increasingly wild rumors about why the Vorath Call Alpha had intervened. I heard a Kethrani blade dancer speculate that the Terran Frontier Corps had developed some secret weapon that made individual human soldiers dangerous enough to worry an apex predator. I heard a Thessian heavy combat specialist claim, with apparent sincerity, that Cade was actually a genetically enhanced super soldier, disguised as an ordinary human to infiltrate the Crucible's defenses. None of them were right. I could feel it in my predator's instincts, the same instincts that had kept my ancestors alive on a world full of things that wanted to eat them. The truth about Cade was not political. It was not technological. It was not genetic. The truth was something simpler and more terrifying, and it was sitting in the observation tier of the Crucible's arena, with a datapad and a stylus, taking notes while the rest of us performed. These were the prestige bouts, the fights between species champions that would determine the Crucible's rankings for the next cycle. The Vorath Call triad was expected to dominate, and they did. Jar, the subordinate who had defeated me the previous day, fought a Gorvathi champion in the opening match, and dismantled him in under 3 minutes. Thesson, the triad's third member, matched up against a Kethrani blade dancer, whose technique was considered among the finest in her species, and finished the bout in 4 minutes, with a grapple-to-submission sequence that looked almost gentle in its efficiency. Then came the semi-final tier, and the arena's attention turned to the remaining challengers. I was in the stands now, my tournament run over after the loss to Jar, watching the fights with the analytical eye of an instructor who has shifted from competitor to evaluator. I was sitting 3 rows behind Tavrel, who had also been eliminated in the quarterfinals. Several seats to my left, a group of Gorvathi fighters were rumbling commentary to each other in their deep chest dialect. I was focused on the current bout when a shift in the energy of the arena pulled my attention away from the fight. The young Vorath Kal, Thesson, had risen from his seat in the fighter preparation area. He was moving toward the challenge podium. My stomach dropped. It was traditionally used by fighters seeking to improve their final rankings or settle grudges that the regular bracket had not resolved. Most challenges in the closing round were between fighters of roughly equal standing. Thesson was not looking at anyone of roughly equal standing. He was looking at the observation tier. He was looking at Cade. I heard Tavrel curse softly in Drenari, a word I did not recognize but whose meaning was clear from his tone. Around the arena, beings from multiple species were coming to the same realization. The young Vorath Kal was about to do what Goran had been prevented from doing the previous day. Thesson reached the challenge podium and spoke into the formal channel. His voice was younger than Krethvol's, sharper, carrying the aggressive edge of a predator who had not yet learned the difference between confidence and wisdom. He issued a formal challenge to Cade, Terran Frontier Corps, observer status, for a ranked bout under standard Crucible rules. The arena went quiet again, but it was a different kind of quiet than the day before. The previous day's silence had been shock. This silence was dread. Krethval moved. The Alpha did not stand this time. He descended. He rose from his seat in the senior fighter tier and walked down the steps to the arena floor with a deliberate, measured pace that made every being in his path scramble to clear space. He crossed the sparring floor in 6 strides and placed himself between Thesson and the challenge podium, with the physical certainty of a wall that had decided to relocate. He spoke to Thesson, and although the formal channel was no longer active, the arena was quiet enough that his voice carried. He told Thesson to withdraw the challenge. Thesson protested. His voice was tight with the frustration of a young hunter operating in the shadow of an alpha who would not explain his reasoning. He argued that the challenge was his right under tournament law. He argued that an observer who could not defend a challenge had no business being registered as a delegate. He argued that the Vorath Kal did not refuse to fight, and that refusing on behalf of the Triad shamed them all. Krethval listened to every word. He did not interrupt, he did not raise his voice, and when Thesson finished speaking, the Alpha turned away from his subordinate and faced the arena. What he said next carved itself into my memory with the permanence of a scar. He said, "The Vorath Kal do not challenge this human. Not today, not any day. This is not cowardice. This is recognition. We know what he has survived. We know what he has done. And we do not spend lives to learn lessons already written in blood." 3,000 beings heard those words, and 3,000 beings sat in stunned silence as the most feared predator species in the galaxy publicly declared that a quiet human, with a datapad, had earned a status they would not contest. Then Krethval turned to Cade. Cade was standing now. He had risen from his seat at some point during the confrontation, and he stood at the observation rail looking down at Krethval with an expression that I could finally read. It was not triumph. It was not satisfaction. It was sorrow. Deep, old, heavy sorrow that had been compressed by time and pressure into something that looked like calm, the way a diamond looks like glass. Krethval lowered his massive head. I recognized the gesture. Every predator species representative in the arena recognized it. It was the Vorath Kal's highest gesture of respect, a salute reserved for prey that had proven itself beyond the hunt. It was never given lightly. It was never given as a political courtesy. It was given only when a Vorath Kal hunter encountered something that had survived what should have been unsurvivable, and in doing so, had earned a place outside the hierarchy of predator and prey entirely. Cade met the gesture with a nod that carried the weight of years. Then Krethval turned back to Thesson, placed one enormous hand on the young hunter's shoulder, and walked him off the arena floor. The silence in the arena lasted for nearly 10 seconds. Then a Gorvathi fighter in the lower tier stood up and brought his fists together in the Gorvathi salute of acknowledged strength. A Kethrani blade dancer clicked her limbs in a rhythm I had never heard before, something ancient and formal. One by one, fighters from species across the Crucible rose to their feet, or made their species gestures of recognition, not toward Krethval, but toward the human standing alone at the observation rail. Cade looked out at the arena. He held the moment for exactly as long as it needed to be held. Then he sat back down, opened his datapad, and looked at the and picked up his stylus. I sat in my seat with my hands shaking and my claws fully extended, and a pressure behind my eyes that I had not felt since the day my first combat instructor had told me that the hardest part of being a predator was not the killing, but the understanding of what it cost. I needed answers. Real answers. Not speculation, not whispered warnings, not cryptic statements about understandings and lessons written in blood. I needed to know what Cade had done to earn the salute of an apex predator alpha, and I needed to know now, because the not knowing was eating at me the way hunger eats at a hunter who has gone too long without a kill. I found my way to the answer through a contact I should not have used. Her name was Linnea, a Terran communication officer assigned to the Crucible's administrative staff. She was not a fighter. She was a logistics specialist who managed the data systems that kept the station running. We had spoken several times during previous exhibitions, enough to establish the kind of professional familiarity that sits halfway between acquaintance and friendship. More importantly, she had administrative access to the station's secure database, the same database where Cade's restricted file was stored. I found Linnea in the communication hub during the late shift, when the hub was minimally staffed and the corridors were quiet. I asked her directly. I told her that I needed to see Cade's file. I told her that the events in the arena had made it clear that the man I had been mocking for a week was something far beyond what his registration suggested, and that I needed to understand what I was dealing with. Linnea looked at me for a long time. Then she said something that surprised me. She said she had been waiting for someone to ask. She said the station commander had flagged Cade's file with a note suggesting that if any allied species representative sought access in the wake of the tournament events, they should be given a partial briefing at the commander's discretion. The commander, she said, believed that what Cade had survived should be known, because understanding it was essential to understanding why the Terran Frontier Corps operated the way it did. She did not show me everything. She told me up front that portions were redacted above her own clearance level, and that what she could share was a summary, not a complete operational record. Then she turned the screen toward me. When I was finished, I sat in the chair next to Linnea's workstation, with my claws retracted so tightly they ached, and my jaw locked, and my eyes fixed on nothing. My body was processing what my mind had just absorbed, and the two systems were not in agreement. My mind wanted to catalog the information, organize it, and fit it into a framework I could analyze. My body wanted to run. The file described the Terminus Frontier incident. The Terminus Frontier was a contested border zone at the edge of Terran-controlled space, a region where the borders of 5 different species' territories converged in a tangle of overlapping claims and unresolved conflicts. 8 months before Cade arrived at the Crucible, a Terran expeditionary unit of 14 soldiers had been deployed to the Terminus Frontier as part of a survey and monitoring operation. Standard border assignment. Low expected threat level. They were ambushed on the 43rd day of their deployment. A coalition of 3 hostile species, acting in coordination, hit the Terran outpost with a force that outnumbered the survey team by a factor of 15 to 1. The attack was fast, overwhelming, and designed to leave no survivors. The outpost was destroyed in the first 19 minutes of engagement. Communication equipment was targeted first, cutting the unit off from any possibility of calling for reinforcement. The extraction corridor that should have allowed the team to withdraw was blocked by enemy forces positioned along every viable route. 13 of the 14 soldiers were killed in the first 2 days. Cade was not killed. The file's language became clinical at this point. The careful, stripped-down vocabulary that military reports use when the events being described are too extreme for normal narrative. Cade had escaped the outpost destruction by being on a solo patrol 5 kilometers from the base when the attack began. He returned to find the outpost in ruins and his entire unit dead or dying. He recovered what equipment he could, including field medical supplies, 3 weapons, and the identification tags of every fallen team member. Then he moved into the wilderness of the Terminus Frontier, with hostile forces actively hunting him. He was alone in enemy territory for 97 days. 97 days. I read that number 3 times, because my mind refused to accept it the first 2 times. 97 days of being hunted by coalition forces that included dedicated tracking units drawn from species whose predatory capabilities exceeded most galactic standards. 3 separate hunting parties were deployed specifically to find and eliminate the surviving human. The Coalition Command considered a single Terran survivor unacceptable, because they could not risk a witness reaching Allied space with information about the ambush. They did not find him. He found them. The file described what the recovery team discovered when a Terran rapid response force finally reached the Terminus Frontier 3 months after the ambush. They found Cade at a location 16 kilometers from the outpost ruins, living in a concealed shelter he had constructed from salvaged materials and natural cover. He was dehydrated, malnourished, and carrying injuries that the medical team later categorized as consistent with sustained survival combat conditions over an extended period. They also found the remains of the 3 hunting parties. The file did not describe what Cade had done to them in detail. It did not need to. The summary stated that all 3 hunting parties had been neutralized through a combination of trap deployment, ambush tactics, and direct engagement over the course of the 97-day period. The methods employed indicated a systematic adaptation of Terran survival training to the specific capabilities and weaknesses of each hunting species, suggesting that the surviving soldier had studied his hunters as thoroughly as they had studied him, and had used that knowledge to turn their own predatory behaviors against them. The final entry in the summary was the one that connected everything. During the 97-day period, a Vorath Call scouting party had been operating in an adjacent sector of the Terminus Frontier on an unrelated mission. They had crossed into the area where Cade was conducting his one-man war against the Coalition hunting parties. They did not encounter Cade directly, but they found the aftermath of his engagements. The report was brief by Vorath call standards, which meant it was barely 3 sentences long. It stated that the scouting party had found evidence of a single predator operating against multiple organized hunting units in sustained asymmetric engagement. It stated that the methods employed were consistent with a highly adaptive Apex-class threat, and it stated that the scouting party had elected not to engage or track the predator because the evidence suggested that doing so would result in losses the scouting party was not prepared to absorb. The scout leader who filed that report was Krethvol. I closed the file. I thanked her. I stood up. I walked out of the communication hub on legs that felt like they belonged to someone else. I walked through corridors that seemed longer than they had been that morning. I walked past my quarters and did not stop. I walked until I reached the senior observation deck on the station's upper ring, the one with the widest viewport, the one where you could see the most stars. The shame hit me there, standing in front of the viewport with the cold light of dead and living stars on my face. I mocked this man. I made him a punchline. I used him to elevate myself in front of my peers. I publicly invited him to come down to the sparring floor so I could show him what combat felt like. I questioned his right to eat dinner at the same table as fighters who had earned their seats through blood and skill. And he let me. Every single time, he let me say whatever I wanted, and he absorbed it the way a mountain absorbs rain. Not because he was weak, not because he was passive, not because he lacked the ability or the will to respond. Because responding to me was not worth the energy of a man who had crawled through a specific kind of darkness that I could not imagine, who had eaten things no living being should have to eat to survive, who had used the last reserves of his body and his mind to systematically destroy the forces sent to kill him, and who had walked out of that frontier carrying the tags of 13 people he could not save. I was not a threat to him. I was not even a nuisance. I was a sound he could hear, but that did not register on whatever scale he used to measure the things that mattered. And the worst part, the part that I could barely bring myself to think about as I stood there, with the stars burning in my eyes, was that he had never once looked at me with contempt. He had never once returned my cruelty. He had never once used even a fraction of what he had survived to make me feel small, the way I had tried to make him feel small. He had simply watched, taken notes, and let me teach myself whatever lesson I was determined to learn through my own arrogance. I stood on that observation deck for a long time. When I finally moved, it was with the slow, deliberate steps of someone who has realized that the ground she has been standing on is not the ground she thought it was, and that the world looks very different from the place where she actually stands. I found him the next morning. The Crucibles exhibition was closing. The final results had been posted, the rankings updated, and the various species delegations were preparing for departure. The corridors had the bittersweet energy of an ending, fighters exchanging contact information, rivals offering grudging respect. The bonds formed through shared combat settling into the durable connections that would carry across the gaps between exhibitions. Cade was in the lower observation ring, the same quiet section where I had found him once before. He was seated on a bench near the viewport, and he was doing something I had not expected. He was cleaning a weapon, Not a ceremonial sidearm, not a tournament-issue training piece, but a Terran field pistol, compact and scarred, its surface marked with the wear patterns of a weapon that had been used in conditions far beyond its design specifications. His hands moved with the automatic precision of someone who had performed this ritual thousands of times, someone for whom the disassembly and reassembly of a weapon was as natural and necessary as breathing. I sat down across from him without asking permission. He glanced up at me, registered my presence, and went back to his work. I did not mock him. I did not posture. I did not perform. I sat there and watched his hands move across the weapon's components, and I saw the scars on his fingers, thin and pale, the kind of scars that come from working with sharp improvised tools in survival conditions. I told him I had read part of his file. His hands paused for the first time. He looked up at me, and his expression carried something I had not seen before. Not anger, not surprise. A kind of resignation, the look of someone who knows that a secret they have been carrying is no longer entirely their own. I told him I was ashamed. He studied me for a long moment. Then he went back to his work and said, very quietly, that I did not need to be ashamed. He said that I had responded to what I could see, and that what I could see had been deliberately constructed to be unremarkable. He said that being underestimated was a tool like any other, and that he did not hold it against the people who used the information he presented to draw the conclusions he had designed them to draw. The precision of that statement chilled me. He had not simply failed to present himself as a threat. He had actively constructed a persona that invited dismissal. The gray uniform, the observer status, the quiet demeanor, the refusal to engage, all of it was intentional. All of it was the camouflage of a predator who had learned that the safest way to move through a room full of other predators was to look like something that was not worth noticing. I asked him why he had come to the Crucible. I said that I understood now, that he was not what he appeared to be, that the observer status was a cover for something, and that I wanted to know what that something was. Cade finished reassembling his sidearm. He set it down on the bench beside him, a motion that was both careful and final, the way someone puts down a burden they have been carrying for a distance they would rather not measure. Then he looked at me with those bottomless eyes and told me the truth. I waited for more. He gave it to me in pieces, the way someone gives away parts of themselves that they have kept locked in dark rooms for a long time. He said that the Terminus frontier had taught him something that no simulation and no classroom could replicate. It had taught him that Terran military training prepared soldiers to fight other Terrans very well. It prepared them to fight most galactic standard threat species adequately. And it prepared them to face Apex-class predator species not at all. 13 soldiers had died because of that gap. He had come to the Crucible to close it. Every fight he had watched, every technique he had documented, every behavioral pattern he had cataloged with his datapad and his stylus and his unblinking attention, all of it was material for a curriculum, a training program that would be implemented across the Terran Frontier Corps for every unit assigned to contested border regions. A program that would teach human soldiers how to recognize, assess, and respond to the combat styles and predatory behaviors of every major species they might encounter. He was not here to prove anything. He was here to learn everything. I asked him why he did not simply request access to the combat databases through diplomatic channels. He said he had considered it, but databases contained technique in isolation, removed from the context of real application. Watching fights in person, watching how fighters adapted in real time, watching how different species responded to pressure and surprise and pain, that could not be extracted from a recording. It had to be witnessed. I thought about his datapad, about the stylus moving in those precise, relentless strokes, about the way his attention sharpened when a fighter executed something exceptional, and the way his hand moved faster when a fighter made a critical error. He had not been taking notes the way an academic takes notes. He had been writing a survival manual for people who did not exist yet. People who would one day stand on a frontier, like the one that had nearly killed him, and would need every advantage he could give them. I asked him about the weapon, about why he was cleaning a field pistol on a station where there was nothing to shoot. He was quiet for a long time. Then he said that the pistol was the same one he had carried on the terminus frontier. He said that he cleaned it every morning because the ritual kept his hands steady and his mind focused, and because it reminded him of what he was working toward. He said that he had made a promise to the 13 people whose tags he had carried out of that frontier, a promise that their deaths would be the last ones caused by Terran soldiers being sent into situations they were not prepared to survive. Every note he took was a lesson paid for in blood he was determined never to spend again. It was the silence of two beings who understood each other very well and knew that some truths are too heavy for casual conversation. I asked him one more question. I asked him if it bothered him, being mocked, being underestimated, being treated as nothing by fighters who had never faced anything more dangerous than a training ring. Cade looked at me, and for the first time since I had known him, something shifted in the depth of his eyes. Not warmth exactly, but a softening, a recognition that the question had come from a genuine place. He said, "I have been hunted by things that make your apex hunters look domesticated. I have eaten insects off rocks to keep my body moving, and used the broken equipment of dead friends to build traps that kept me alive for one more night. I slept in holes I dug with my hands, and woke up to the sound of things trying to find me, so they could finish what they started." It was said with the flat, quiet honesty of someone who had already been through the worst thing that can happen to a person, and had found a way to keep breathing on the other side, and who measured the world by that experience the way a mountain measures weather, from a height where most storms pass without touching the peak. I sat with that answer. I let it settle into me, and then I did something that I had never done for anyone outside my own species. I offered him access to the Vithari combat archives. He looked at me with genuine surprise, the first unguarded reaction I had ever seen from him. I explained. The Vithari combat archives contain decades of predatory technique documentation, hunting strategies, close quarters methodology, and tactical analysis of every species we had encountered in conflict. It was one of the most comprehensive combat databases in Allied space, restricted to Vithari military personnel and their designated allies. Access was granted by instructor rank officers, and I was qualified to make the authorization. I told him that if he was building a curriculum to keep his people alive, he should have everything I could give him. I told him that what I had done to him over the past week was inexcusable, and that I could not undo it, but I could offer something that might make the weight he carried slightly lighter. I told him that the archives were not a gift, they were a debt. He was quiet for a long moment. Then he said thank you. 2 words, simple and direct, but the way he said them carried a weight that told me he understood exactly what I was offering, and exactly what it cost me to offer it. We sat together in silence after that, watching the dead star through the viewport, 2 predators from different worlds sharing the same space without the need for competition or dominance, or any of the posturing that had defined our interactions until that moment. The dead star's faint glow pulsed in slow rhythms against the glass, and I realized that Cade watched it the way he watched everything else, with the patience of someone who had learned that the universe moved at its own pace, and that demanding it move faster only wasted energy you might need later. I understood then that his stillness was not emptiness. It was conservation. Every quiet moment was fuel stored for a purpose I was only beginning to comprehend. The crucible would go quiet for the weeks between exhibitions, its corridors empty, its sparring rings dark, its purpose fulfilled until the next cycle brought the next generation of fighters to test themselves against each other. I was in the departure bay, supervising my Vithari cohort's boarding preparations, when I saw Cade walking toward the Terran shuttle bay with his single duffel bag over his shoulder. He walked the same way he had walked the day he arrived, unhurried and quiet, and completely unremarkable to anyone who did not know what I now knew. As he reached the junction that would take him to his shuttle, Krethval appeared. The Alpha Vorath Call stepped out from a side corridor and positioned himself in Cade's path. Not aggressively, but with the deliberate placement of someone who had been waiting. Cade stopped. He looked up at the massive hunter. Neither of them spoke for several seconds. Then Krethval spoke, his deep voice carrying through the corridor, with the resonance of a drum struck once. He said, "When you teach your young to survive, teach them this as well. The greatest predator is not the one who wins every hunt. It is the one who chooses which hunts are worth the blood." Without the involuntary responses that every other species on the station had shown in the presence of a Vorath call Alpha, he said, "We already know that. That is why I sat in the stands instead of standing in the ring." Krethvol made a low, rumbling sound. It was the deepest register of his species' vocalization range, a sound I had heard once before in my life, and had been told was the Vorath call equivalent of laughter, the kind that comes from encountering something genuinely unexpected from a species you thought you had fully categorized. Then the Alpha stepped aside, and Cade walked past him toward his shuttle. Neither of them looked back. I watched Cade's shuttle detach from the Crucible's docking clamp and pull away into the void. I watched it grow smaller against the backdrop of the dead star until it was just another point of light among millions. I watched until my eyes ached from staring at brightness, and my chest ached from something that had nothing to do with my cracked rib guard. I think about him now. Not every day, but close to it. I think about the way he walked into the Crucible and drew no attention and demanded no respect and offered no threat. I think about the datapad and the stylus and the notes that will one day become a training program that will save lives he will never meet. I think about 13 soldiers who died on a frontier that should have been routine, and about the one who survived and turned his survival into a purpose that was bigger than revenge or glory or the need to be seen. I think about what I learned. I learned that the most dangerous beings in the galaxy are not the ones who dominate the arena. They are not the ones who roar or posture or display their weapons for the crowd. They are the ones who sit quietly in the stands and take notes, because those are the ones who have already been through something that the arena cannot replicate, and they have come out the other side carrying a weight that would crush most beings, and have decided to use that weight to build something instead of destroy something. I learned that the most terrifying thing about humans is not their strength, their endurance, or their capacity for violence. It is their ability to carry devastation inside themselves and still choose restraint. To sit in a room full of predators carrying enough pain to burn a world and spend their energy building something that will keep others from burning with them. I understand now that I was looking at a man who had decided that fighting was the least important thing he would ever do again, and that decision scared the apex hunters more than any weapon ever could. a predator you can prepare for. But a man who has been through the fire and come back quiet, a man who has earned the right to rage and chosen instead to teach, a man who carries the dead in his pockets and the future in his hands, that is something the galaxy has no category for. That is something even the Vorath Call will not challenge. And that, more than anything else, is why the apex hunters refused to fight. Not because they were afraid of losing. Because they understood something that I had needed a week of arrogance and shame to learn. Some battles are not won by the strongest fighter. They are won by the one who walks away from the ring and does something that matters more than winning. Cade walked away. And in doing so, he won something that no tournament could ever award. The respect of predators who had never respected anything they could not kill. That is the human way. And it is, I have come to believe, the most dangerous thing in the universe.